Even after all the conversions I've done, it's still quite satisfying to hear that first startup. But before I get ahead of myself, we need to actually finish it off. The customer supplied his own airbox for this one, and I've just plumbed it in with the airflow meter and a couple of silicon bends. First of all, we need to make the exhaust. As you can see, the Y pipe's hitting on the pan here, the flange is a little bit short, and that's going to interfere with the drive shaft. And around the back here, the flange is sitting hard up on the transfer case. The reason being is this is for a 4L60, not a 6L80, but that's nothing we can't fix with a bit of modification. I've cut a slit in the flange on the one side here so I can adjust the angle away from the transfer case. Even so, this flange is going to be in the way right next to the transfer case and the chassis rail, so I'm going to cut that off as well. Also, you can see this bend here is going to interfere with the drive shaft, so we're going to have to cut that off and change the angle. Now that I've cut that up, I'll put it back on so I can check my clearances. Once I've got it where I want it, I'll tack that flange and move on to getting the other side to fit. With the driver's side flange tacked, I've moved that bend down a little bit to clear the drive shaft, and I had to add a little extension piece. I also had to adjust the passenger side flange a little bit. And as for the rear, I'm just going to add a little extension to bring the flange out past the transfer case. I've got that extension piece on now and the flange tacked, and ground back all of the other little tack welds ready for final welds. This is it, all finished and painted up. I only MIG welded the flanges on because they were MIG welded anyway, but on all of the joins I wanted to TIG it up so it was as neat as possible. Before I fit this up, I'm going to move on to doing all of the heat shields. For most applications I use this style heat shield. You can get it in many different brands, but as long as it's got quite a few layers, it's usually all the same. I've cut out a strip to cover the fuel lines all the way along the rail here, and also a larger piece to cover up the fuel lines and the fuel filter. On the passenger side, I've also cut up a strip to cover up the brake lines, and another section to cover up the transmission cooler lines. Now I've got all the heat shields fitted, I've bolted up the Y pipe that we're finished making. You can see I've got nice clearance against the transfer case now, and it's time to move on to doing the cat back. Where I can, I'll buy an off-the-shelf system. It works out cheaper than making it from scratch. This one in particular is just for the diesel. I should be able to use most of it, but I'm going to cut the front half off the muffler here and fit it up to the vehicle. With the front half of this section cut off, all I need to do is weld this 3-inch flange on now, and it should be good to go. With the flange now welded to that muffler, I need to make up a straight section in between these two flanges with the cat in the centre. This wasn't overly hard, it was just 2 flanges, a bit of straight pipe and the cat all welded together. And with that done, I just need to fit one final heat shield up over the muffler here to protect the fuel regulator, and we're all done with the exhaust. So that means it's time to move on to the wiring. I use these standalone looms made by Alan Gibbs at Calmaker. They come with all of the relays and fuses wired in. They are one of the easiest looms I've used to hook up. There's only a few wires you need, like this big fuel pump wire here. Mil is for the engine light. You have obviously your tacho. Starter trigger that's hooked in with its own neutral safety. Speedo output from the ECU. And the ignition supply voltage. It also has twin triggers for thermofans with its own fuse and relay. This is the supply voltage for all of the fuses and relays. The output from the starter trigger. And that's it. That's all you need to wire up yourself. All the rest just plugs into the engine like normal. This is the original engine loom from the old carby engine. I need to take it out and cut it open. We will be using some of it, but not all of it. I've fitted the standalone loom to the engine and run all of the fuses and relays inside the cab. Now, as for those wires that you have to hook up yourself, this one's the main power for all of the relays. I just hook this onto the back of the alternator. These other two were the thermofan triggers. I just added a couple of earth wires that will earth onto the block. I've extended the wiring on the thermofans that he already had fitted and added a plug to go in between the two. Now from underneath you can see the starter trigger wire, and that just goes up to the top of the solenoid there. I use 32 square mil battery cable and I run it from the secondary battery down to the isolation block, from there up to the alternator, and from the alternator back to the main battery. I also run it from the main battery positive down to the starter motor. If you remember last time, I run 2 wires down the back for each fuel pump. Now I need a way to trigger each pump individually. When you press the sub-tank button, you can hear the solenoids at the back clicking. The wire that triggers those 2 solenoids is down in the passenger kick panel here. I've tapped in a length of wire that I'll now use to control the relay. In this case, that wire is giving us a positive voltage reference, so I can just use an earth on the other side of the relay. I've got my 2 fuel pump wires, the reference wire we just tapped in, and the fuel pump trigger wire from the standalone loom. To clear things up, I'll show you this wiring diagram. The sub-tank solenoid trigger wire will trigger the normally closed relay, so when there's no power to it, it'll just run the normal fuel pump. And when you hit the sub-tank button, it'll power up this relay and pull the pin over to run the sub-tank fuel pump. I've got the purple fuel pump wire from the standalone loom in pin 30 and the trigger wire in pin 86. The earth, I'm just going to use this little tab with an eyelet on the end, put that into pin 85. Now I need to work out which fuel pump wires which, since I didn't label them, so I'm just going to apply power and then listen for which fuel pump comes on. The first one you could hear there was the sub-tank. I didn't have any fuel in it just yet, so it was a bit loud, and the other one must be the main tank. I'm just having a look at the relay there to make sure I don't muck up the pin location. The main tank we're going to run to pin 87A, and the sub we're going to run to pin 87. The good thing about running twin pumps in these Landcruisers, you always have that redundancy, so if one fuel pump does die while you're out in the middle of nowhere, you can just hit the sub-tank fuel button and you're on your way. With the relay now wired up, I'm just going to set the fuel pressure. You can see when I move from pump to pump, the fuel pressure won't change at all because it's running through the same pressure regulator. All that's left is to put the relay back in, and that's the whole fuel system done. It's time to move on to the inside. This plug is for the tap up tap down module. We'll worry about that a bit later. I've got these wires that we spoke about earlier. The OBD2 port. This is the plug for the throttle pedal. We'll just run that across to the other side. And mount the fuses and relays up under the dash. I found a nice spot out of the way for the fuses and relays. And now I'm just going to pull apart the stock engine loom. I've stripped all of the conduit off the standard engine loom. I've got quite a few things that I don't actually need, like this plug that used to go to the automatic choke. The original owners chopped half of these wires in half for some reason, but we've still got the starter trigger hanging out there. And then we've got the loom that heads down to the gearbox. All that's actually in this is the reverse lights and the forward drive engage light for the dash. I have one side apart here, and I've isolated the oil pressure sensor, which is the grey one on the left, and the coolant temp sensor, which is the green one on the right. There are all these extra wires that don't actually make it through the other side of the plug. All it does is the reverse lights and the forward drive engagement light. I've cleaned this loom up by de-pinning all of the wires that I don't actually need. The only two wires that are actually going down to the gearbox now is the forward drive engagement light. The reverse lights will run inside the cab now, and then there's just the oil pressure and the coolant temp that will run inside the engine bay. And this is all the unnecessary wiring that got removed. As for the other plug, I've just de-pinned everything for now, and we'll re-pin it with what we need. What was left of this loom I've run through the firewall, except for the reverse lights. And we'll go on the other side and hook up the forward drive engagement light, as well as the oil pressure and coolant temp sensor. Marks sell an adapter for the standard coolant temp sensor to go in the back of the LS head. We'll just run the green wire over to this. They also do the adapter for the oil pressure sender, and the grey wire runs to that. Moving on to that handful of wires that we had before. This dash in particular doesn't have an engine light, and it's a cable driven speedo, so we won't be using these two wires. I will be using this tacho wire, the ignition trigger, and also the starter trigger. To keep it looking neat and tidy, I've used the original pins off the old wires and just soldered it to the end of the new ones. Now the tacho wire wasn't actually in this plug. I've put it here just to make it neat as well, but I'll show you where I stole that from. Under the dash there's this brown box. Now the black wire with the silver dot is the tacho wire, and to be able to put it in the other side of that plug, I actually needed a male pin which I stole out of the old plug from the gearbox loom. And once I had that pin soldered on, I just installed it in one of the empty slots in the back side of that plug. This is the shift module we'll be using for the tap up, tap down, and this just plugs directly into the loom. There's only a couple other wires that we need to hook up, including the switch for the tap up, tap down. You just got up, down and common, and they join into these three wires here. These other two are for the reverse lights, but it can't handle high current, so we need to put a relay in between. And then finally you just got power and video out for the LCD screen. I've got the shift module plugged into the wiring loom, and I've added another plug here just to make it easy for removal if need be. I've got the switch for the tap up, tap down wired in, as well as the power and the video out for the LCD. These are the outputs of the reverse lights from the module. When you select reverse, this circuit closes. So I've got one side for earth and the other side's going to earth out the relay. Factory reverse lights power the relay, and when you select reverse, the relay will bridge the yellow and red wire, turning the reverse lights on. Now it's finally time for that first startup. Now that I've got it running, we'll check if the dash actually works. We've got no tacho, and the oil pressure sender is sitting right at the bottom of the gauge. So I'm going to have to remove the dash and fix it. With the dash out, I need to remove the clear fascia off the front. That just comes off by pushing in these clips here. With the fascia now out of the way, I need to remove the tacho itself, and that just comes out with these 3 screws here on the back. Once those 3 screws are out, you can just gently lift the tacho out of the dash. Now that I've got it out, I need to solder a jump wire over one of the resistors. The resistor we need to jump is this one here next to the diode. And that's all you need to do, reinstall the dash now. Now the dash is reinstalled, we'll start it up and give it a go. Tacho seems to work good now. I've already adjusted it in the tune to match the ECU output. Still need to finish off the rest of the tune, that is why it's idling a little bit high, but we still need to sort out that low oil pressure issue. The engine doesn't actually have low oil pressure, you just need to adjust the switch itself. You take the can off the top, and you've got this little ramped wheel, and if you turn that while the engine's running, you can adjust the gauge to sit somewhere in the middle. So with those changes made, we'll see how it looks. It sits just above a quarter on idle, and when you're going down the freeway or you give it a rev, it'll sit somewhere in the middle. While I've got all of the dash fascia off, I'm going to wire in the park lights for the gear shifter. I've just joined into the circuit where the little light is in the ashtray. Last up for the wiring is the air conditioning. The trigger for the aircon on switch is this yellow wire, and then it goes out the black wire with the white trace. That wire ends up in this plug that we de-pin completely, so we just added a wire back in and I'll run that back out to the engine bay. I've run that wire through the hole in the firewall, and I've run it up with the fuel pump wire in amongst that conduit. The wire we've run over here is the trigger for these 2 relays. One of them runs the fan and the other one runs the AC compressor. Both relays are supplied power through these 2 fusible links. Since we're not running a clutch fan, I just had to add a small thermo to the AC condenser. With the custom AC lines made up, that concludes the wiring part of this video. We can move on to something a little less boring, like the dyno. I'm not going to bother showing all of the runs because it takes a fair while, so we'll just cut straight to the power run. For the roadie now?
Aha, yeah. Yeah, it's going to make sure the gears are okay and everything.
Beautiful.
The limit or anything silly like that?
Yeah, excellent.
Go on, mate.
Now that Alan's finished the road tune, we'll take it for a drive and see how it all goes. LCD screen that comes with the shift module is quite handy. It displays quite a few useful readouts like tacho, trans temp, and obviously what gear you're in. All of the dash is working perfectly now, including the temp gauge that you didn't get to see before. Well, here we are, job's done, and the car's ready to give back to the customer. Quite happy with how this one turned out. It's quite a nice little combo. He should be quite happy with it. It will be a vast improvement over the old 6-cylinder manual setup. Be great for towing, highway cruising, all that good stuff. And with that, it finishes up this little 3-part series. And once again, thanks for watching.